They snickered when he said a black man raised him, but no one expected what that man left behind or how it would silence an entire room. The vaulted ceilings of the private club shimmered, light refracting from polished wood and discreet brass fixtures. The scent of aged whiskey and prime rib mingled with expensive cologne and hushed conversation. Talk drifted between mergers, golf handicaps, and boarding school escapades, polite, practiced, and just a touch too self-satisfied. Arthur sat straight-backed, his tie perfectly knotted, a half-finished scotch in hand. His fiancée, Julia, smiled beside him, at ease in this environment. He reached for a memory from his own childhood, trying to find a point of connection. "When I was a boy," he said, a small smile touching his lips, "I used to help Mr. George work on the old truck. I'd hand him tools, mostly just getting in the way, but he'd let me stay as long as I was quiet. Then, when it was time for a break, he'd whistle a tune to let me know." He chuckled softly at the memory, the warmth of it a brief, flickering ember. A beat passed. Across the table, Julia's older sister, Stephanie, sharp angles and sharper judgment, raised an eyebrow, nonplussed. "Mr. George," she repeated. "You mean the driver?" The room fell into sudden stillness. A cufflink clinked awkwardly against a glass. Even the ice in the drinks seemed to pause its melt. Arthur's smile tightened, but his hand clenched under the table. His other hand trembled faintly on his glass. He looked down quickly, nodding once. "Yes," he said quietly. "He was more than that." No one followed up. The conversation shifted awkwardly to yacht races and market trends. Julia didn't notice or chose not to. Arthur sat in silence, the warmth drained from his face. That night, long after the liqueurs had been served and the night's forced laughter faded, Arthur stood alone on the balcony of Julia's apartment, staring out over the city lights. A chill breeze lifted his hair, but he didn't feel it. He remembered the feel of Mr. George's hands, how they smelled of oil and earth, how they'd buttoned his small coats and wiped scraped knees, how they'd been the only constant. When the rest of his world felt empty, he blinked hard, eyes stinging. They'd snickered, because to them he was just the help. But to Arthur, Mr. George had been home. The small house stood quietly at the edge of a tree-lined street, worn but familiar. Its once crisp white trim had faded to gray, and the porch creaked under Arthur's hesitant steps. Weeds curled around the edges of the walkway like unspoken memories. The mailbox still read G. Washington etched in faded gold letters. Arthur stood before the door, now padlocked, his breath shallow. He pressed his palm gently against the wood just for a second and closed his eyes. And suddenly he was 6 again. The world had been too big for him then, too loud, too lonely. His mother had been a presence in perfume and distant calls. His father a signature on checks. But Mr. George had been there. Arthur remembered clinging to George's thick, steady hand the first time they stood in front of this house. He remembered being confused. Why were they in a different neighborhood? Why didn't his mother come inside? "Just for a little while," his mother had said, already backing down the porch steps, sunglasses hiding her eyes. "He'll take care of you." George had stood in the doorway, a worn work jacket over his shoulders, his face lined with both age and patience. "You come on in now, son," he'd said gently. Arthur had obeyed. Inside, the house was nothing like the one he came from, but in the best way. There was no marble, no silence, no cold. Here, everything was filled with something richer. Blues music drifting from a dusty old radio, the scent of warm sawdust and pipe tobacco, the creak of wooden floors beneath socked feet. In the evenings, George would hum while teaching Arthur to tie knots or carve small wooden birds, patient fingers guiding his own. "Skill takes time," he'd whisper, "and you got plenty of it." He taught Arthur how to say grace. Hands folded, eyes closed, heart soft. He read adventure stories in a quiet, steady voice, changing tones for every character. He made Arthur laugh, and more importantly, he listened when Arthur cried. Arthur had never told anyone that he used to wake in the night from bad dreams and tiptoe down the hallway, just to press his ear to George's bedroom door. Hearing his gentle snore was like proof that the world was still turning. That was home, but it didn't last. Eventually, his parents pulled him back into their world of prep schools and overseas holidays. George never protested, just clasped his shoulder and said, "You remember what I told you? Stand tall and be kind, even when others forget how." Now, standing in front of the house decades later, Arthur felt a hollow ache in his chest. The gutters were broken. The small garden was gone. No radio played. Inside, he stepped off the porch and circled the side. A cracked window allowed him to peek in. Dust danced in the light, settling over a worn armchair that used to cradle him as he drifted off to the sound of rain. Arthur pressed his forehead against the glass, tears rising unexpectedly. He'd forgotten how seen he used to feel here, and now it was all fading. Back in the present, a car honked distantly. The neighborhood had changed. Some homes were freshly painted. Others, like this one, were slowly surrendering to time. Arthur took a step back and exhaled. He reached into his bag, pulled out a small, smooth stone he had found by a stream earlier. He laid it on the porch railing next to the rusted bell. Then he whispered, "Thank you." As he walked away, he didn't look back. But in his chest, a warmth stirred again. Not unlike the one he'd felt wrapped in George's steady arms, breathing in pipe tobacco and comfort and blues. He hadn't just lost a driver. He had lost the only father figure who had ever fathered him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to honor that. The library smelled like dust and old paper. Arthur stepped inside with the hesitance of someone entering a sanctuary, not a building lined with books. The ceilings were high, the lights soft, and the silence respectful. He clutched his bag a little tighter, his heart pounding as he approached the information desk. "I'm looking for someone," he said softly, the words catching in his throat. His name was George Washington. He lived nearby. He helped raise me. The librarian, an older black man with kind, knowing eyes, looked up slowly. His expression shifted from routine politeness to recognition. "You mean Mr. George?" Arthur's breath caught. "Yes, you knew him?" The man's smile was small but warm, touched by sadness. Everyone knew Mr. George. He stood up and beckoned Arthur to follow. They walked through the aisles until they reached a quiet corner where a small community bulletin board stood. Old photos, flyers, and dedications were pinned with care. The librarian pointed to a framed notice. It was an obituary. George Washington, aged 81, a beloved caregiver, neighbor, and uncle, passed away peacefully. Arthur's world narrowed to the words on the paper. While his parents were busy with their lives, their trips, their business deals, while the man who once meant everything to him had quietly slipped away, the librarian placed a gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder. He used to come here all the time, loved history and woodworking books, always had a photo in his wallet, a little white boy with scraped knees. He'd show it to anyone who'd listen, called him his son. Arthur's lips parted, but no words came out. The librarian stepped away, giving him space. Arthur moved like a ghost through the rest of the library, his footsteps muffled by the carpet until he found a bench by the window. He sat and pulled out his phone, scrolling aimlessly, his reflection faint in the glass beside the gray sky. He thought back to the night of the dinner party, the way his fiancée's sister had snickered. "You mean the driver?" The way the whole table had gone quiet, as if acknowledging something impolite, something disposable. But Mr. George had not been disposable. He had been everything. Arthur pressed his fingers to his eyes, holding back the tears. Guilt laced itself through his memories now. Guilt for the years he didn't visit, for the cards never sent, for the way life moved forward, and he hadn't thought to look back. Later that afternoon, the librarian handed him a pamphlet from the nearby community center. "You should see this," he said. Arthur walked to the address on foot. The center was modest, red brick, and bustling. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby basketball court. Inside, murals lined the walls painted by local youth. A sense of pride pulsed in the air. In the main hallway, a polished wooden plaque caught his eye. He stepped closer, reading the words etched into brass. In honor of the child I raised with love, Mr. George Washington. Below the inscription was a small photo, faded but unmistakable. It was Arthur, around age 7, grinning with 2 front teeth missing, arms wrapped tightly around George's waist. The world spun. Arthur had never known this photo existed. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, breath shuddering. This wasn't just a dedication. It was a confession, a love letter to him, proof that Mr. George had never forgotten that even in absence, he had held Arthur close. A man walked by and noticed him staring. "You knew him?" Arthur nodded. "He raised me." The man smiled. "He talked about you like you were his. Said he prayed for you every day." Arthur turned his face away, overwhelmed. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who had somehow loved the same man he did, Arthur felt both deeply connected and unspeakably alone. Love, guilt, longing. They crashed over him like waves. Memories of adventure stories. Warm, rough hands, George humming low spirituals as he worked on a small engine. He whispered under his breath, "I'm sorry I waited so long." But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to remember him right, not as the driver but as family. The wind had picked up as Arthur returned to the old house. Its sagging porch groaned beneath his steps, and the scent of damp wood and dust drifted through the air as he unlocked the rusted latch on the door. The floorboards creaked like whispers, ghosts of laughter and stories still lingering in the walls. He wandered room to room, touching the chipped paint, the faded curtains, the ghostly outline on the wall where a framed picture once hung. It was in George's bedroom that he paused, drawn to the wooden floor near the bed's corner. Something about the floorboard, worn and slightly warped, made him kneel. He tugged gently, and it lifted with a groan. Underneath was a small tin box wrapped in a disintegrating piece of plain fabric. Arthur's fingers trembled as he lifted it out, brushed the dust away, and opened the lid. Inside, bundles of folded papers yellowed at the edges and tied with string. Letters all addressed to him, Arthur Thomas Beaumont. He sat on the edge of the bed on the same mattress where he once curled up next to Mr. George, begging for just one more story, and untied the first bundle. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, a bit rough, but steady. The loops of the G's wide and purposeful. The ink had faded, but the love bled through every word. May 23, 2005. My sweet boy, you turned 7 today. I polished the old truck like I always do and left the hood up for a bit. Silly, I know, but it made me feel close to you. I wonder if you still like the blues or if you still fall asleep with your hands covered in grease from trying to help like you used to. I miss your questions, your easy laugh, your stubborn little feet dragging across my floor when you didn't want to tie your shoes. Wherever you are, I hope someone is making you feel strong and safe. I hope you know I loved you like my own. Always will. Arthur's hand flew to his mouth. The tears came too fast to stop. He read another. December 25, 2009. Christmas morning. I sat alone this year. I thought I saw a boy like you walk by outside the window, but it wasn't you. I keep the tree small now. Just me and a little wooden bird you once carved that always tips over. You're probably taller now, maybe driving, maybe dating girls. I just hope someone's been there to tell you how proud I am. One by one, he read them. Birthday notes, holiday reflections, musings about life and loss, hope and heartbreak. Each year, George had written even though he never sent a single one. The words were quiet and aching, full of love, but restrained by fear. Fear of rejection or perhaps a belief that Arthur had moved on, that he didn't need him anymore. Then came one letter dated just after Arthur's high school graduation, June 18, 2016. I saw your photo in the newspaper. Honor roll. That's my boy. You had your father's build in that photo, but your smile, that was mine. I was gonna write you, but I didn't. I suppose I was scared. Not of you, of myself. But I wanted you to know. You may forget me, but I could never forget you. Never, Arthur. His breath caught. That sentence echoed louder than any memory. It had been true. Arthur had forgotten. Forgotten how it felt to have someone guide his hands with care, to be read to sleep, to be held without condition. Not because he didn't care, but because life had swept him into its river, and he hadn't known how to swim back upstream. Suddenly, a folded square of paper slipped from one of the envelopes. He opened it. A photograph. Arthur, no older than 5, sitting in George's lap on the porch steps. Both of them laughing. Arthur's head thrown back, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. George's arms wrapped around him protectively, proudly. The photo had been handled often. Its corners were soft, the edges slightly curled. Arthur clutched it to his chest. The letters still spread around him like fallen leaves. For years, he had thought of George as a chapter from his childhood. Now he knew the truth. George had been the story. He had loved in silence, remembered in secret, and written pages meant for a boy who never stopped being his. Arthur leaned his head against the wall, his tears now steady but silent. The house no longer felt abandoned. It felt full of words never spoken, of love never forgotten, and of a man who had left behind far more than memories. He had left proof. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray that pressed against the windows and made the world feel slower, quieter. Arthur sat at a small cafe on the edge of George's old neighborhood, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept much. The box of letters remained unopened beside him in a canvas tote, their weight more emotional than physical. He was lost in a memory when a voice interrupted. "Excuse me, Mr. Beaumont." Arthur looked up to see a tall older man in a well-worn suit jacket and wire-framed glasses. His skin was deep brown, his eyes kind but measured. He carried a thin folder tucked under one arm. "I'm Reverend Amos. I was a friend of Mr. George's." Arthur stood instinctively wiping his hand on his coat before offering it. He talked about you every day," he said with a small smile. "Would you walk with me?" They strolled down the block past cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. Children's voices echoed from somewhere nearby, mixing with a distant hum of a passing bus. "He told me to give you this," Reverend Amos said, handing him the folder. "Only if you ever came back. Only if you remembered him." Arthur hesitated before opening it. Inside was a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. "To Arthur Thomas, with everything I never got to say." His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a neatly folded letter and beneath it official-looking papers. He unfolded the letter first. "My sweet boy, if you were reading this, then you came back. I always believed you would. You were never just a child I looked after. You were the reason I kept waking up some mornings. You brought purpose into my life when I had none of my own. Your spirit was wild and stubborn, just like you. I loved teaching you. I loved the way you asked questions I couldn't answer. You were curious, determined, and far too bright to stay in the shadows of anyone's expectations. I never had children of my own, but I had you, and that was more than enough. This house was all I had left in the end. Not much, but it's yours now. The deed is enclosed. So are the savings I left in trust. Small, but I hope they help you build something strong and true. You gave my life purpose. This is how I say thank you. Love always, Mr. George." Arthur didn't realize he was crying until he tasted the salt on his lips. The deed was real. The signature still firm in George's handwriting. A modest sum from a lifetime of frugality, carefully saved and quietly tucked away, was now his. He looked up at Reverend Amos, his eyes blurred with tears. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I never said thank you. I never told him." "You were a child," he said gently. He never expected anything in return. He just wanted you to be okay. Arthur sat on the curb in front of the boarded-up house. He remembered a smaller version of himself trying to fix a broken toy truck. He remembered the blues music, the quiet concentration, and George's voice telling him stories from memory. Now those walls, once full of music and work and laughter, were his. He pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. Mr. George had waited quietly and without expectation for years, not with resentment, but with love. With the kind of love that didn't need to be seen to be real. Arthur had been part of his legacy all along. He stood slowly, turning toward the house. Maybe, just maybe, this was his time to give back, to fill the rooms with new purpose. To let Mr. George's story, his care, his dignity, his quiet strength, echo through someone else's life. A legacy not measured in wealth, but in love given freely. The ballroom shimmered in candlelight, polished to perfection. Strings of lights sparkled above linen-draped tables, and the air was thick with perfume, champagne, and polite laughter. It was the kind of evening meant to impress, an engagement celebration hosted by the Sterling family, an event Arthur had once felt he was finally worthy of. But now it felt different. Arthur stood near the grand piano, a champagne flute untouched in his hand. His fiancée, Julia, had just toasted to their future with the practiced ease of someone born into comfort. Now the room turned toward him, waiting for him to say a few words. He hadn't planned to speak, but something in his heart said, "Now." He placed the flute down. In his hand, folded neatly, was the faded photograph he had kept close since the day he found it. The image of a little white boy, maybe 5 or 6, grinning wide in the arms of a black man who radiated warmth and strength. He stepped onto the small stage, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. Conversations hushed. Arthur looked out across the room, businessmen in suits, women in designer gowns, and in the back, Julia's sister, Stephanie, the one who had snickered just days earlier, with a smirk and the words, "You mean the driver?" He took a breath. "When I was asked to speak tonight, I wasn't sure what to say, but then I thought about who I am, and more importantly, how I became who I am." He held up the photo. "This man," he said, voice steady but soft, "was not my driver. His name was Mr. George. He was my world." A ripple moved through the crowd. "Some people inherit money," Arthur said. "I inherited strength." A pause. "Mr. George taught me to fix things, not just trucks, but broken pieces of myself. He read me stories when no one else came home. He taught me how to stand tall, not just at the dinner table, but in how I moved through the world." His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. "When my parents were busy hosting dinners like this one, it was Mr. George who taught me to ask real questions, to see beyond polished surfaces and guest lists, to know that quiet dignity was never weakness." He glanced briefly at Stephanie. Her eyes dropped. The smirk was gone. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have power. But he had love. A love so constant, so unshakable. It stayed with me even when I didn't know it. Arthur's hands gripped the edge of the podium, his voice now firmer. "He wrote me letters for years, letters I never received, tucked under floorboards of a house I forgot. And in his final words, he left me everything he had. Not because I needed it, but because I mattered to him." The room was utterly still. "I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you this because we are too quick to forget the people who shape us. We're too comfortable rewriting our stories to fit what makes others nod along." He smiled then, eyes bright but fierce. "I was raised by a man the world overlooked. But I see him now, and I want you to see him too." A standing silence, not applause, just reverence. Arthur stepped down slowly, the photograph still in his hand. Julia reached for him, eyes wet with pride. Even her father gave a respectful nod. But it was Stephanie he noticed most. She looked away, ashamed, perhaps, for the first time, truly realizing the weight of what she'd mocked. Arthur didn't need their approval anymore. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had brought George into that glittering room, not as a footnote, not as the help, but as the heart of the story. The morning was crisp, touched with the scent of jasmine and sun-warmed pavement. In the quiet corner of a city park, one George used to take him to, Arthur stood with both hands gently resting on the back of a newly installed wooden bench. The small bronze plaque on it gleamed under the sunlight, its engraving read, "In loving memory of George Washington, he raised the future with strength." Birds chirped softly from nearby trees, and children's laughter floated from a nearby playground. It was simple, peaceful, just the way George would have liked. Arthur sat down, smoothing the hem of his jacket. He had chosen not to invite a crowd. No photographers, no press releases, just a few from the community center and a young black boy sitting beside his mother watching curiously from across the path. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the moment and the memories, the scent of sawdust, the feel of George's hand guiding his, blues humming from a kitchen radio, a voice deep and steady telling him he was sharp as a tack and loved beyond measure. He opened his bag and pulled out the worn photograph once more. Himself, 6 years old, grinning wide in George's embrace. Beside it now was one of his own choosing, the photo of the community center's plaque, the one that read, "In honor of the child I raised with love." He had been that child. He still was. "I found your letters," he whispered aloud. "I'm sorry I didn't look for you sooner." The wind rustled the leaves in response. A soft voice startled him. "Did you know him?" Arthur looked up. The young boy had wandered closer, his small face tilted toward the bench. Arthur smiled gently. "Yes," he said. "He helped me grow, helped me become me." The boy's mother called him back and he skipped away, his small hands swinging. Arthur turned back to the plaque, his eyes misting. This wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about claiming it, owning it, because the world might have called George the help. But Arthur now knew the truth. He had been the heart. And now his story, quiet, unseen, powerful, would live on, one park bench at a time, in the lives he touched, and the love he gave freely. With that, Arthur stood. He pressed his hand one last time to the cool metal plate and walked forward, not away, but onward. A man not just shaped by love, but ready to pass it on.